Welcome to 101 Stories from Ambient Whisper. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. The echo of the Azure Mariner. The ocean has a way of making everything feel small and significant at the very same time. When you are out there, hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline, the world narrows down to the metal beneath your boots and the horizon that never seems to get any closer. My name is Elias, and I have spent the better part of 20 years guiding container ships across these vast, salt-heavy stretches of blue. It is a quiet life mostly. You learn to love the rhythm of the engines. That deep mechanical heartbeat that tells you everything is as it should be. The ship I currently command is called the Morning Star. She is a sturdy vessel, carrying over 4,000 steel containers filled with everything from electronics to wool blankets. It was a Tuesday, or perhaps a Wednesday. The days tend to bleed into one another when you are at sea. The sky was a pale, milky gray, and a soft mist had begun to roll over the waves, curling around the stacks of containers like a cold, damp blanket. It was the kind of weather that makes you want to wrap your hands around a warm mug of tea and stay inside the bridge, watching the wipers clear the condensation from the glass. The bridge was quiet, save for the low hum of the instruments and the occasional crackle of the radio. My first mate, a young man named Julian, was leaning over the radar screen. He is a good sort, quiet and observant, which is exactly what you want in a companion on a long haul. He cleared his throat, a small sound that seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. He told me that there was something on the radar, something that had not been there 5 minutes ago. I walked over to the screen. The green sweep of the radar was steady, and there, about 12 miles to our north, was a solid blip. It was moving slowly, almost drifting, at a speed of about 3 knots. That was unusual. Most commercial vessels in these lanes move with purpose, their engines pushing them toward a deadline. This ship was barely crawling. I picked up the binoculars and stepped out onto the bridge wing. The air was chilly, smelling of salt and wet iron. I squinted into the gray haze, trying to find a shape in the mist. For a long time there was nothing but the shifting walls of fog. Then I saw it. A dark silhouette began to sharpen against the pale background. It was a cargo ship, perhaps a little smaller than the Morning Star, but well kept from a distance. There was no smoke rising from her funnels, no white water churning at her stern. She looked like a toy sitting in a bathtub, perfectly still and perfectly silent. We tried to hail them on the radio. Julian called out across the frequencies, his voice calm and professional. He asked the vessel to identify herself and state her intentions. There was no reply, not even a hiss of static. We waited for several minutes, the silence in our bridge feeling a little heavier than before. We tried again, and then once more on the emergency channel. Still, the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of our own engine. As we drew closer, the name on her bow became clear through the mist. She was registered as the Azure Mariner. I recognized the name. She was a known vessel, a reliable worker of the seas that had been reported in port just 2 weeks ago. According to the records, she should have been carrying a crew of 22 people. She looked completely functional. Her paint was clean, her cranes were tucked away in their travel positions, and her lights were even flickering on as the afternoon light began to fade. But as we pulled alongside, only a few hundred yards away, we realized that something was very wrong. There was no one on the deck. On a ship that size, you usually see someone. A lookout, a deckhand tidying a line, or even just a face behind the glass of the bridge. The Azure Mariner was a ghost. Her railings were empty. Her lifeboats were all tucked securely in their davits. She was sailing, or rather drifting, with a strange kind of grace, but she was a hollow shell. I decided then that we couldn't just leave her. A ship adrift in a shipping lane is a hazard, and more than that, there was a nagging pull of curiosity in my chest. It was the kind of feeling that keeps you awake at night, a question that demands an answer. I told Julian to prepare a small boarding party. We would take the scan boat over, climb the pilot ladder, and see if anyone needed help. In my mind, I imagined a sudden illness or perhaps a failure of the communication system. I didn't want to think about the other possibilities. The transition from our ship to the Azure Mariner was a strange experience. As our small boat pulled away from the Morning Star, the sound of our own engines faded, replaced by the slapping of waves against the hull of the ghost ship. The Azure Mariner towered over us, a wall of rusted red and ocean-stained white. We found the pilot ladder hanging over the side, swaying gently in the breeze as if it were waiting for us. I was the first to climb up, followed by Julian and our chief engineer, Marcus. When my boots hit the deck, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't just the absence of voices. It was a total lack of mechanical life. There was no vibration in the floor, no hum of ventilation. The only sound was the wind whistling through the rigging and the distant, rhythmic clanging of a loose latch somewhere on the upper deck. It was a lonely sound. We stood there for a moment, letting our eyes adjust to the deck of the strange ship. Everything looked perfectly normal. There were coils of rope neatly stacked near the winches. A pair of heavy work gloves lay on a hatch cover, looking as though someone had just stepped away for a moment to grab a cup of coffee. I picked up one of the gloves. It was dry and still smelled of grease and salt. There was no dust on it. The person who wore it couldn't have been gone for long. We moved toward the bridge, our footsteps echoing loudly on the metal stairs. Each step felt like an intrusion into a private space. We reached the heavy steel door of the bridge and I turned the handle. It wasn't locked. It swung open with a slow, mournful groan, revealing a room bathed in the soft, green glow of the instrument panels. The bridge was immaculate. On the charting table, a map was laid out with a brass compass sitting right on top of a marked course. A half-finished mug of coffee sat in a cup holder next to the captain's chair. I reached out and touched the side of the mug. It was stone cold, the surface of the liquid covered in a thin, dark film. Next to it, a pipe sat in a glass ashtray, the tobacco inside burned down to a gray ash. Julian went to the radio console. He checked the dials and the power settings. Everything was switched on. The equipment was working perfectly. He picked up the handset and listened, then shook his head. There was no signal, no transmission, just the empty air of the ocean. Marcus, meanwhile, was looking at the engine telegraph. It was set to slow ahead, which explained why the ship was still making some progress, but the gauges showed that the fuel pressure was non-existent. The engines had stopped, yet the ship was still moving through the water with a steady, haunting momentum. We searched the living quarters next. This was where the cozy feeling of the ship began to turn into something more unsettling. In the galley, the table was set for dinner. There were plates of beef stew and bowls of bread. The stew had gone cold and congealed, but it hadn't begun to rot yet. It looked like the crew had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of their meal. There were no knocked-over chairs, no broken glass, no signs of a struggle. It was as if 22 people had just vanished into thin air, leaving their dinners to grow cold in the silence. I walked down the narrow corridor toward the captain's cabin. The air here felt thicker, smelling faintly of old paper and lavender. It was a comforting smell, the kind you might find in a library back home, but here, in the middle of the ocean on a silent ship, it felt out of place. I pushed the door open. The cabin was small and tidy. A photo of a woman and two young children was propped up on the desk, tucked into the corner of a blotter. A book lay open on the unmade bed, its pages fluttering slightly in the draft from the door. I picked up the book. It was a collection of poetry. I looked at the page that had been marked. It spoke of the sea as a mother and a grave, of the way the stars watch over those who wander. There were no notes in the margins, no clues as to where the captain might have gone. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, feeling the gentle tilt of the ship. The Azure Mariner didn't feel like a place of violence. It felt like a place of deep, profound rest. We spent the next 4 hours searching every inch of that ship. We went down into the cargo holds, where the massive containers sat in the darkness like sleeping giants. We went into the engine room, where the giant pistons stood still and cold. Marcus pointed out that the tools were all in their shadows on the wall boards. Not a single wrench was out of place. Not a single drop of oil was spilled where it shouldn't be. The most unsettling thing was the logbook. We found it back on the bridge, resting in its designated spot. I opened it to the last entry. The handwriting was clear and steady. It described the weather conditions from earlier that morning. The mist, the calm seas, the temperature of the water. The last sentence ended abruptly, but not because of a struggle. It ended mid-thought, as if the writer had simply forgotten to finish the word. It read, "The light on the horizon is more beautiful than we." And that was it. No mention of trouble, no mention of another ship or a mechanical failure, just a comment on the light. As the sun began to set, the Azure Mariner took on a different glow. The orange light of the fading day crept across the decks, casting long, dancing shadows. The ship seemed to breathe with the tide. We stood on the bridge wing, looking back at the morning star, which was keeping pace with us a few hundred yards away. My own ship looked so solid and real, while the Azure Mariner felt like a dream that was slowly dissolving. We didn't find a single soul, not a cat, not a bird, not a human being. We found their clothes, their wedding rings on bedside tables, their half-written letters to home. We found a deck of cards spread out in the crew lounge, a game of solitaire half-finished. But the people were gone. It was as if the sea had reached up and gently plucked them from the deck, leaving everything else untouched. Julian suggested we try to tow the ship, but I knew the Morning Star wasn't equipped for that kind of weight, especially with the Azure Mariner's engines seized up. Besides, there was a feeling in my gut, a quiet, insistent voice. That told me this ship didn't want to be towed. It had its own destination, one that wasn't marked on any of our maps. We gathered our things and prepared to leave. As I walked back down the pilot ladder, I looked back one last time at the bridge. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind the glass, a shadow shifting in the corner. But when I blinked, it was gone. Only the reflection of the setting sun remained, burning like a fire on the windows. We returned to the Morning Star in silence. The crew was waiting for us, their faces full of questions that I couldn't answer. I went to my own bridge and watched through the binoculars as the Azure Mariner drifted back into the mist. The fog seemed to swallow her whole, starting with the stern and moving slowly toward the bow until only the tip of her mast was visible. And then she was gone. I sat in my chair for a long time that night, listening to the familiar heartbeat of my ship. I thought about the stew in the bowls and the poem on the bed. I thought about the light that was too beautiful to describe. The ocean is full of mysteries, some of them terrifying and some of them strangely peaceful. The Azure Mariner was a reminder that we are only guests on these waters. We have our schedules and our routes, but the sea has its own clock. I never reported the ship as a wreck. I reported it as a sighting of a vessel in transit. I like to think that they are still out there, somewhere in the places where the fog never lifts. Maybe they found whatever it was they were looking for in that light on the horizon. Maybe they are just sailing on, free from the weight of the world, in a ship that never needs fuel and a sea that never ends. The next morning, the sun rose over a clear, blue expanse. There was no sign of the mist and no sign of the Azure Mariner. We continued our journey toward the coast, our containers heavy with the things of the world. But every time I see a flicker of light on the edge of the horizon, I think of that silent ship and the 22 people who decided to follow the beauty into the unknown. It is a spooky thought, yes, but in the quiet of the night, it is also a very cozy one. Thank you for listening. For more content and support, please like, comment, and subscribe.